Hi there, how's it going? I am Stephen Lahan. I am an early careers coordinator here at Channel 4. Thanks for joining today. What we're going to be talking about is something that I am super passionate about myself, which is interview and workplace adjustments. So, this is in terms of any sort of particularly disability related adjustments that you might need to an interview process or once you're actually in the workplace. We're going to be talking about it from an employer point of view. So it should hopefully be interesting and give you a bit of an insight into the type of things that are totally reasonable for you to ask for and the type of options that are available to you once you are applying for roles. Previous to coming to Channel 4 and working on the early talent team, have worked in a lot of roles where I was dealing with interview adjustments. For just over 3 years, I was managing interview adjustments at Google for all of Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. So I've seen a pretty wide gambit of types of accommodation. So hopefully I can answer any questions that you have today. I'll be totally honest, and hopefully it'll give you a bit more confidence in terms of knowing what you can ask for and how to go about asking for it. What we're going to be running through is a little bit of inclusion in general and why it's actually really important to businesses and why it's in businesses' interest to be inclusive employers. We're going to look at interview adjustments themselves, so the type of things that you could ask for, the type of options that are available there in terms of adjustments. Then we're going to look at workplace adjustments. So once you've been successful in the interview process, you're actually in the role, what kind of adjustments might work for you? And then we're going to do a little bit of just tips and tricks in terms of confidence building um, that is useful for any role that you're going for, disability or not. We can all use a little bit of a boost in confidence. So what we're going to move on to now is looking at why inclusion is important for companies. So you may or may not recognize this person up on the screen. Her name is Temple Grandin. She is a really incredible, world-renowned engineer, particularly around animal husbandry is the term that they use. And this is a quote from her here: "The world needs different kinds of minds to work together." This is actually from her TED Talk, which I highly recommend you watching. So Temple Grandin is incredibly successful at what she does. She is on the autistic spectrum, and she is responsible for redesigning about 50% of the slaughterhouses across America. So where animals go to abattoirs, where animals go to be slaughtered for meat. A very grim thing, but she was able to basically, when she started in the industry, she noticed that there was huge issues with the production lines. Animals were getting spooked, animals were getting caught in equipment, and that was massively slowing down the productivity of these massive abattoirs, costing them huge amounts of money, and also a pretty horrific experience for those animals as well. And because of how she views the world, she was able to look at the animals' behaviors and notice patterns that other people hadn't noticed. So with the cattle, she was able to notice how they moved, what tended to spook them, when they were the calmest, and how they liked to move in kind of fields and in settings that were natural and not restricted. And because she was able to notice these patterns that other people hadn't noticed, she was able to completely redesign how these slaughterhouses operated in a way that was a lot more, I guess, calming for the cows that were going through. They were designed with curves. They were designed so shockingly they didn't see each other getting slaughtered, which, surprise, surprise, was quite distressing for the animals. But I think that Temple Grandin is a really excellent example of she didn't succeed at in her industry in spite of her autism. She succeeded in her industry because of it, because she viewed the world in a different way, because of the perspective that she was coming at this job with. She was able to find solutions that other people up until that point hadn't been able to find. And I think that's true in terms of any process or application or job that you're going into is if you are someone with a disability, you have a unique perspective to bring to that. You have a unique approach to problem solving that you've been using in your life. And that's why it's really important that when we are hiring um, for for our workforce, that we're hiring a really wide range of people because they're all going to be bringing different skills and different insights. With that in mind, I am going to talk you through some of the really well documented reasons why diversity and inclusion is important to companies in general. So you'll have seen over the past kind of uh, 10, 20 so years, a massive focus on diversity and inclusion within companies. And that's not just because it's like quote unquote the right thing to do. It actually has huge benefits for the companies themselves. So, in terms of, let's say, for example, understanding your audience. So, if we take Channel 4 as an example, who are our audience and who are the people who are watching our programs? So they're going to be people from all across the UK, from all different walks of life, with all different backgrounds. And we want to be creating content that appeals to our audience. We can only do that if we have people creating the content and making those decisions who have a wide range of insights and a wide range of backgrounds. So that's why you'll see in terms of when we're creating content, for people with disabilities, for example, we'll have a lot of disabled on-screen talent. We'll have a lot of writers in the rooms who are people with disabilities, so that we're creating content that we can really understand and speak to the true voices of the people who are watching. So that's why it's really important to have a diverse workforce. So you're not just kind of guessing what your audience might need or might want. There's really well documented financial benefits to having a diverse workforce that that feels included and that feels valued in the workplace. And it's also really useful to have people with diverse backgrounds because they can challenge the norm, so how things are normally done. So sometimes you might be in an organization and you see something that's kind of either inefficient or ineffective or a waste of time. And sometimes you'll ask someone who's been there for a long time, why do we do this particular process or we do this particular step? And sometimes the answer you'll get is, oh, I don't know, we've just always done it. And when you bring in people who have a different perspective on things, they can challenge those norms and say, actually, I don't think that that is the most effective way of doing that, or that is the most efficient way of doing it. Touching on that, we also have diversity of thought. So that's really important because if people are all from the same backgrounds, all had the same experiences growing up, they're probably going to come up with the same kind of solutions to solving problems. Whereas if you have people from a really wide range of backgrounds, they're going to have different skills, different viewpoints, different perspectives on how problems can be solved. And effectively, you're going to get a much more effective solution from having a group of people with a wide variety of thoughts and backgrounds. And then also retaining talent. So it's really important. It's a huge cost for companies to try keep recruiting and replacing people who might leave because they don't feel valued at a company or that they don't feel that their input is important. So retaining talent is a really important part of that in terms of making sure that we've an inclusive workforce. And also, a lot of people from the disability point of view, a lot of people develop disabilities later in life. So if we've set up a workplace where there are accommodations that we can put in place, we can keep that talent even if they do become disabled later in life and still keep all that valuable knowledge, all those valuable skill sets while making those accommodations. Also, as we go through, feel free to leave any comments or questions in the chat. Feel free to ask me any questions in terms of accommodations and adjustments. I am happy to answer them, and we'll get to those at the end. So now we're going to talk about interview adjustments. So some of you watching may have interviewed with adjustments before, and we'll go into what we mean by adjustments. It's basically any tweaks or changes to an interviewing process that are done to remove barriers that might be in place for one person but not for another. So a really good example of this is if we are interviewing candidates and let's say for a finance role, and part of that role involves looking at a large set of a spreadsheet of numbers, um, and one of the people who's interviewing has a visual impairment, providing that person with either a larger font if we're doing it on paper, or allowing that person to access it via a digital format using their screen reader. That would be an adjustment that in no way makes the process easier for them, but it does remove the barriers that are in place of them not being able to see very small numbers, for example. So when we talk about disability, we're talking about it from, I guess, a legal perspective. And when you look at employment law, there's a really wide range of things that are included within the kind of larger umbrella of disability. And some people who might, let's say, fall into one of these categories mightn't personally identify as having a disability themselves. That's totally fine. You can still avail of adjustments if any of this is applicable to you. So when we think of disability, the two kind of first things that come to most people's mind is sensory disabilities. So things like visual impairments, things like being deaf or hard of hearing. And then the other one that a lot of people think of is physical impairments. So either being a wheelchair user, having some sort of mobility issue, potentially, having a prosthetic limb. So those are the two that we kind of see the most in life. We see them on TV, we see them when we're out and about because they tend to be quite visual disabilities. Whereas there's also a huge range of hidden disabilities or ones that mightn't be particularly apparent when you first meet a person, but can massively affect them in their day-to-day life. So other things that fall into this category of disability would also include specific learning disabilities. So that's things like dyslexia, dyscalculia, speech or language impairment. So whether someone has either a, a difficulty processing language or a difficulty communicating. So, for example, a stammer or a stutter would be captured under that category. Mental health, a lot of people don't realize falls under the umbrella term of disability. So that could be anything in terms of depression, anxiety, the whole wide range of mental health spectrum is covered and is protected by employment law under disability. Then you have the autistic spectrum, and then you also have chronic illness, which a lot of people don't realize falls under the term of disability. So that could be anything from, let's say, Crohn's disease, chronic asthma. Um, Also, if you were recovering from a long-term illness, like let's say, for example, cancer, that would all be covered under disability. So disability covers a lot more than we necessarily um, automatically think it does. And a lot of people could fall into one or more of these categories. You could have multiple disabilities, or someone could develop one of these disabilities later in life or have it for a temporary amount of time, and or the symptoms of it could just affect them for a temporary amount of time. So there's really a large, wide range. And that's why we're looking at it from categories rather than kind of a list of every type of disability that's out there, because that list is endless. So that's kind of how we approach it in terms of accommodations. We kind of try figure out what the category of disability is. As an employer, I don't need to know. Let's say, for example, you're looking for an interview adjustment. You don't need to come to me and tell me what the medical diagnosis of your disability is, because I'm not a doctor. So chances are it's going to be some sort of long Latin name that I won't understand. Whereas if I understand the impact of what your disability is, then I'm much better going to be able to help make recommendations of accommodations or put those accommodations in place. And we'll touch a little bit later on in terms of those classifications of disabilities and whether you need to prove that you have a disability or and all of that. But they are the kind of wide spectrum of what we mean when we're talking about disability on this call. In terms of processes, so this is what the process interview process looks like at Channel 4. Um, It can vary from company to company, but this is just to kind of give you a taster of the type of steps that you might go through, and that accommodations can be made and adjustments can be made at any point during this process. So first off, what most people do is apply online. So you would send in your CV and you'd also send in any additional questions that we might ask you. Those additional questions might be things like, why would you like to work at Channel 4? Why do you think you're a good fit for this role? And they're usually submitted in written format. There's lots of adjustments that can be made to this process. So if at any point you encounter a barrier of you being able to complete those steps, get in touch and we'll look at how we can adjust that. So let's say, for example, if which sometimes happens with companies where their application process for submitting and answering questions, so that very initial start of the process, sometimes it's not compatible with screen readers. And in that case, most of the time the company isn't aware until a candidate actually flags it to them. So in that case, that's something where you might say, where the recruiter might say, okay, well, please send it in via email while we work on making those fixes to our software. So that would be a type of accommodation there. And again, this is just our process at Channel 4, but if you were successful at that stage, we would then move candidates on to a self-record video interview via HireVue. So that's where you would sit in front of your laptop or your phone, tablet, whatever, and answer questions that come up on screen that are related to the role. So tell me about a time that you had to work as part of a team, for example. Again, that might present certain barriers to certain people. Um, those are timed, for example. So if you had a speech or language impediment, it might make it difficult for you to get your answer out in that, say, 5 minutes that you've been allocated to give your answer. So that's an adjustment that we could make, is change the timing of that interview and make sure that you have enough time to get your answer out. Um, then the next stage in the process, so if you were successful at that, you would move forward to a live video interview with the hiring manager. So that would be much more like a standard Teams, Zoom, Skype call, that kind of thing, where you would be I mean, face to face, I suppose screen to screen is maybe more accurate. And again, that could present certain barriers for certain people in terms of either the technology that you're using, in terms of a wide variety of things. Again, timing might be one of them. If the interview is scheduled for 45 minutes, someone might need a longer time in terms of answering those questions. And that's another accommodation that we could make there. And then you get through to the final stage, which is offers. So if you're successful in the role and they're actually putting together the contract. What people sometimes don't realize is that you can ask for accommodations at any stage during this process, and you don't have to disclose your disability at the first stage of the process to then, let's say, for example, you get to the video interview stage and you say, actually, at this point, I want to disclose my disability and I want to request accommodations. It's never too late, with the exception of if you've already done the interview and then you realize, actually, I might have benefited from having adjustments in place. It can get very tricky because sometimes we've really strict deadlines that we need to get through in terms of when those hires need to be made or when decisions need to be made. So sometimes we can't always go back and repeat interviews. So that's why it's really important that you let us know ahead of your interview if you think that you're going to need accommodations. But you can ask for them at any stage of that process. When we look at the type of adjustments, so as I was saying before, we don't have kind of an exhaustive list of these are all of the different types of disabilities and names for them in the world. The same goes for interview adjustments. We don't have a list of these are all of the different type of adjustments that we have in place, but they tend to fall into different categories. So one of them would be adaptations to the structure of the day. So this is probably the one that comes up most often and is requested by candidates most often. And all of these are pretty easy for people to put in place. So they're all completely like normal adjustments that you might ask for. So adaptation to the structure of the day might mean, for example, if the interview is scheduled for 45 minutes as standard, we might extend that to an hour, or we might add an additional 10 minutes. It really depends on the impact of your disability, and we might do that for a variety of reasons. So you might ask for additional time because your auditory processing is impacted, or you have a speech and language impediment, or you need more time to be able to, let's say, for example, if you have a hearing impairment and you need to ask the interviewer to repeat the questions multiple times. So they're a really common adjustment that's made, but another type of adjustment to the structure of the day might be um, rather than having two interviews back to back, that you ask for a 15-minute break in between those interviews. So those are all things that are really easy for us to put in place as long as we know in advance that those are things that we need, adjustments that we need to make. Addition of a tool or a service. So that might be, for example, piece of assistive technology. So if you need to have access to a screen reader as part of your interview, if you needed us to book a sign language interpreter to be present for your interview, um, so that's kind of like having an additional thing. Again, these are all just about removing the barriers that are in place. It's not at any point making interviews easier for people. And that's why we really want to encourage you to ask for them, because we know that these are things that people need in terms of interviewing for them to have a fair process. Adaptations to the format of a meeting. So that could be, let's say, for example, we were talking about those video interviews earlier on. It could be rather than having those video interviews that you actually where you're pre-recorded, you might have a Teams call where you're dealing with someone directly live, or it could be that you actually come into the office and meet face to face rather than doing it via video. Again, it really depends on what the impact of your disability is. Um, Another option, which I think people don't realize that you can ask for, is disclosing an aspect of your disability to the interviewer in advance. And again, all of this is completely up to you. We're not going to put accommodations in place without asking you first, and making sure that you are comfortable disclosing these to the interviewers, and having these adjustments in place. So, so disclosing an aspect of your disability to the interviewer in advance, it could be, for example, if you were hard of hearing and you wanted the interviewer to be aware that you're hard of hearing, and ask them not to do things like covering their mouth when they're speaking, or turn away from you when they're talking, or have light behind them so that you can't see their face, because they're in shadow. Those are all things that you can ask for and might make you feel a lot more comfortable going into that situation, that you know you don't need to um, start your interview off by disclosing your disability, that that's done in advance and that they have time to figure out what they need to do to make those adjustments themselves. And then the last one is pretty straightforward. So it's specifications with regards to the physical environment. So that might be if you're a wheelchair user or if you have any sort of mobility issues, making sure that you have access to an accessible bathroom, that the building itself is accessible. Um, and yeah, so those are all different types of adjustments, and there's no real direct one-to-one link between the type of adjustments that you can ask for, and as we go back, the type of disability that you might have. So it's not a case where, for example, if someone says to us, I'm interviewing for this role, I'm dyslexic, um, and we say, okay, well, then you have to have extra time, you get the slides in advance, um, have a break in the middle of the day, because it really depends on how your disability impacts you, on what's going to work best for you. So you might have two people going for the same role who have the same disability. So for example, two people who are dyslexic, and they might request very different accommodations, and that's totally fine. It's about what's going to work for them and what's going to remove those barriers for accessibility for them. So what I'd really advise there is having a think about, if you are going to ask for accommodations and maybe you've never had them before at interview, which of these might benefit you, and there could be more than one, in terms of making you feel you're most comfortable and making you feel like there's as few barriers as possible for you being successful at that interview and demonstrating all the skills and all of the reasons why you're the best person possible for that role. Here at Channel 4, we do something called the Guaranteed Interview Scheme. So a lot of companies across the UK use this scheme. And what the guaranteed interview scheme means is that if you opt into it, so when you are applying for the role at first, it might ask you, do you have a disability? If you click yes, it might ask you, would you like to opt into the guaranteed interview scheme? And what the guaranteed interview scheme means is that as long as you meet the minimum criteria on that job spec, so on the job description, when it says, you know, uh, it might have preferred qualifications and it might have mandatory qualifications. So mandatory might be, if you were going to be working on a team editing some of our things for social media, a mandatory requirement might be that you have familiarity with Adobe Creative Suite, for example. So basically what this means is that if you opt into that scheme and you meet all those minimum entry criteria, then you'll be moved forward to that higher view interview stage, so that initial stage. The reason why we do this is because we know that a lot of people who have disabilities mightn't have had those same kind of early opportunities to get that kind of experience. So it kind of gives you it removes again, it's again about removing barriers. So removing that initial barrier of you actually getting to demonstrate and speak to someone about the skills that you have and why you might be best for that role. So that's the guaranteed interview scheme. There's no obligation to opt into it. There's also no obligation for you to disclose that you have a disability at interview stage. Um, so that is completely up to yourself. But it's really useful to know that that option is there. Um, and I would recommend opting into it um, if you think that you might benefit from it. Um, Here's some common misconceptions that we get all the time about candidates who might want to request adjustments but don't feel comfortable. These are some of the reasons why they don't. And from an employer's point of view, I can kind of give you a bit of background on why these aren't true. So we've already touched on, I have to disclose my disability from the start of the application. Absolutely not true. It's completely up to yourself. You've no obligation to disclose your disability at any point. Um, you might want to because you want to avail of adjustments, but you've no obligation to mention your disability. If I ask for interview adjustments, I'll have to provide proof of my disability. You will never be asked to provide proof of your disability. A lot of people don't have any proof of their disability. Let's say, for example, if you um, like certain conditions, if you're a wheelchair user, you mightn't have medical records that say you're a wheelchair user, but you use a wheelchair. So so that's all the proof that anyone needs. You're never going to be asked to provide proof of your disability. You'll often also not be asked actually what the name of your disability is. It's not particularly useful to us as employer, whereas understanding what the impact of your disability is useful for us for being able to figure out what accommodations are going to work for you. If I interview with adjustments in place and I get the role, it's only because they made the interviews easier for me. So, as I've reiterated a few times throughout this session, these adjustments are not about making interviews easier. They're about removing the barriers that disproportionately affect people with disabilities. So, it's really just a tool to make the playing field as level as possible for everyone. So if you interview with adjustments and you get the role, um, the interview process that you went through was no easier than any other candidate who was going through that role. So don't feel like it's in any way, you know, because there was any sort of concessions made for you. Those adjustments are there for a reason, and it's to make those processes as fair as possible. So now we're going to move on to workplace adjustments. So these might be slightly different to the adjustments that you look for at interview stage, because interviews are kind of a weird setting in general. They're not necessarily reflective of what your day-to-day job might be like. Um, Obviously they're a condensed amount of time. There are a lot of questions and answers, um, and yeah, they mightn't be reflective of what you're actually doing on a day-to-day basis. So what might work for you as an adjustment at interview might necessarily be the adjustments that you would have in place in the workplace. And these are some of the common misconceptions in terms of the actual workplace adjustments. So I have to disclose my disability before I start the job. Again, it's completely up to yourself whether or not you disclose your disability. Obviously, you will want to disclose your disability if you want those accommodation or adjustments to be in place on your first day. So, for example, if you have any sort of physical accessibility needs, you'll want to be letting the company know as early as possible so that they can start getting working on any changes that they need to make, any adjustments, any accessibility checks that they need to be making on their building. Um, so the earlier you let the company know, the more likely you are to have those adjustments made before you actually start. Um, but there's no obligation to disclose your disability before you start a role. Because as well, you might not be sure if you need adjustments or not be sure what kind of adjustments will work for you. So you might choose to start the role, be in it for a couple of weeks, and then say, actually, these are the adjustments that are going to work for me, and you can request them then. I can only access workplace adjustments if I have a physical or sensory disability. So again, this goes back to there's some things that are kind of more visual when we talk about disability and we talk about adjustments. So for example, a wheelchair ramp is going to be a very visual indicator of accessibility. But you might, let's say, for example, be on the autistic spectrum, and one of your workplace adjustments could be um, that your manager follows up any verbal instructions with a written email. That is a totally suitable workplace adjustment. That doesn't involve any piece of tech, it doesn't involve any physical thing being brought in, but it's going to make a massive impact on you in terms of being able to succeed in your job. And then the last misconception that we have up here is if I request a workplace adjustment, people will think I'm not capable of doing my job. Again, this is a totally understandable fear that people have in terms of asking for adjustments. But again, these adjustments are being put in place to remove barriers that that affect you disproportionately to other people. It's not about making your job in any way easier. You've been hired to do that job because you have a particular skill set and you have a particular thing that you can add and the company can benefit of. So it's within their interest to put these adjustments in place so that you can reach your maximum potential in that role. And when we talk about workplace adjustments, there's definitely some similarities in terms of the type of categories that these fall into. So an adaptation to the structure of your working day, that might be, let's say, for example, starting slightly later in the day. So starting at 10 a.m. and finishing at 6 p.m. because you take medication that has an impact on you and makes you drowsy first thing in the morning. That would be an adaptation to the structure of the day, or being able to have a slightly longer break in the middle of the day so that you can um, take a nap, for example, because of the impact of your disability. Access to a tool or assistive technology is another type of adjustment. So again, this could be things like screen readers. It could be things like a lot of these assistive technologies are actually built into systems now. So things like spelling and grammar check, um, and those kind of tools are kind of thankfully pretty standard now. But those are kind of things that you could ask to be put in place. Access to a service. So that could be, for example, having a sign language interpreter at any large conferences or having a sign language interpreter at any business critical meetings. Could be something that you might request in the workplace. Again, communicating specific requirements to your manager or colleagues. So that could be, For example, I've put accommodations in place before that involve a person starting in a role, and they have a visual impairment, and they wanted a list of kind of helpful tips to go out to their colleagues before they started. And they might be things like, please be aware that if you leave bags in the walkway, that they're a massive trip hazard for someone who has a visual impairment. If you are presenting slides, please send them around in advance if possible so that I can look at them in my own time. So all those kind of things that are more so about being conscientious for colleagues, they're requests that you could put in place as well, that kind of make everyone a lot more comfortable and understand what the best way is to work collaboratively together. And then again, the last one is pretty straightforward, which is specifications with regards to the physical environment. So that could be accessible bathrooms, accessible doorways, making sure that meetings are booked in rooms that are wheelchair accessible, those kind of things. So again, there's no exhaustive list of the type of workplace adjustments that can be put in place, but that's just to give you an idea of the type of things that could be put in place and could remove barriers to your day-to-day working and help you to achieve your maximum potential in the workplace. Going to look at a little bit of confidence building tips. These are applicable for absolutely everyone. Again, as we go through these, if you do have any questions that have been coming up or percolating in your head, now is the chance to ask them. So there is the live chat that's going alongside this, so please drop your questions in the comments below and we'll cover them at the end. Um, just some top tips: identify your strengths and capitalize on them. It can be really easy to focus on the things that you're not great at, particularly when you're starting out in a role and applying for jobs. But keep in mind that you have a huge amount of transferable skills and things that you're good at, and really look at framing that for yourself and for the employer as what are the things that you can bring to this role that are unique to you. Um, be aware of imposter syndrome. So um, it's a term that you hear an awful lot. Imposter syndrome is this idea of if you walk into a room of people um, and you might walk into a new workplace, into a new team, and in your head there is a niggling voice that says, you don't deserve to be here. Everyone else here is so much smarter than you, so much more skilled than you. Um, and eventually they're going to figure out that, you aren't meant to be here, and that you just got here by luck or by chance. Um, everyone feels like that. People get imposter syndrome at absolutely every level of their career. It's not an accurate reflection of how actually skilled or how valuable you are to that team. It's our own insecurities. So you need to make sure that you find ways to be able to tamp that down. And one of them is to really focus on your successes rather than your mistakes. Think about all of the compliments or positive reinforcement that you're getting when your manager tells you you've done a great job, or when your teammates thank you for doing something. Focus on all those successes rather than the one piece of constructive criticism or the one thing that went wrong that day, because I'm sure there's a lot more things that went right that went wrong. If not in a particular day, then definitely in your week. And then the last one is just to challenge yourself. So make sure you're stretching yourself. If you see an application where you say, okay, there I meet 10% or like 10 of the things that are listed on this job application, I meet nine of those essential criteria, I recommend you still apply for it, because chances are there's probably very few people who are their dream candidate and meet all of those criteria. So challenge yourself and push yourself out of your comfort zone. With that, I'm going to check if we have any questions. No, no questions. I will give you another minute or two before I log off. But I will say that we do have a bunch of opportunities coming up within early careers, one of which I'm very excited about, which is our virtual work experience. So on our virtual work experience, you can sign in and there will be 5 different tasks to complete across that give you a taster of all the different types of things that we do here at Channel 4. So there's a task that's set by commissioning, a task set by sales, legal and compliance, looking at making sure that our programs are okay to air. um, and be seen by kids. It's a cool task. It's a Gordon Ramsay program. You have to figure out what can and can't be shown during the daytime. You can imagine there's a lot of swearing in there. Um, and yeah, consumer insight and social media management as well. So there's loads of exciting things coming up. Keep an eye on our Four Skills website and on this YouTube channel as well. So thanks so much for joining us today, and we will see you very soon. And we have all of the other sessions from the lives are on our YouTube page as well. So make sure you check those out. Thanks so much for joining today.